In the summer of 751, beneath the scorching sun of Central Asia, two titans prepared to collide in a battle that would reshape the ancient world. Along the banks of the Talas River, where the steppes meet the mountains and empires meet their destiny, the greatest military powers of the age assembled their forces for a confrontation that would echo through centuries. This was not merely a clash of armies. This was a collision between civilizations, between the rising crescent of Islam and the ancient dragon of the East. The fate of the Silk Road, the future of continents, and the course of human history itself hung in the balance on those dusty plains. The year 751 marked a moment when the world stood at a crossroads. From the golden halls of Chang'an, the Tang dynasty commanded an empire that stretched from Korea to the edges of Persia. Their armies had marched triumphant across mountains and deserts, their banners flying over countless conquered cities. Yet, from the west, a new power had emerged from the sands of Arabia, carrying with it the fervor of a fresh faith and the ambition of unlimited conquest. The Abbasid Caliphate had just torn down the old order, seizing power from the Umayyads in a revolution that shook the Islamic world to its foundations. Now these two colossal empires faced each other across the narrow valley of the Talas River, each convinced of their divine right to rule the lands between. But this story begins not with the clash of steel, but with betrayal. In the bustling markets of Tashkent, where merchants from a dozen nations haggled over silk and spices, a chain of events was set in motion that would draw the superpowers of the age into their ultimate confrontation. The city of Tashkent, known then as Shash, was ruled by a king whose loyalty had wavered between the competing giants that surrounded his small but strategically vital kingdom. When conflict erupted between the rulers of Fergana and Tashkent, it seemed like just another petty squabble between minor Central Asian princes. Yet this local dispute would become the spark that ignited a fire across the ancient world. The king of Fergana, desperate to gain advantage over his rival, made a fateful decision. He appealed to the Tang dynasty for military assistance, calling upon the Chinese to intervene in what appeared to be a minor regional conflict. The Chinese response came in the form of Gao Xianzhi, a general whose name would soon be written in blood across the pages of history. Born of Korean descent in the western reaches of the Tang Empire, Gao had risen through the ranks, not through noble birth, but through cunning, courage, and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the treacherous politics of frontier warfare. Gao Xianzhi was no ordinary commander. Despite his slight build and unremarkable appearance, he possessed the mind of a strategic genius and the heart of a warrior. His campaigns had taken him across the roof of the world, over the towering peaks of the Pamirs, through valleys where the air was so thin that horses stumbled and men gasped for breath. He had conquered kingdoms, captured kings, and filled the imperial treasury with the spoils of war. Yet it was precisely this success that would lead to his downfall, for victory had made him arrogant, and arrogance would make him careless. When Gao arrived in Tashkent with his army, the king of Shash made what he believed was a wise decision. Recognizing the overwhelming power of the Tang forces, he surrendered without a fight, opening his gates and submitting to Chinese authority. The king had every reason to believe that his submission would be honored according to the ancient customs of Central Asian warfare. Surrender, when offered freely, was traditionally met with mercy. The conquering general would accept tribute, perhaps take hostages to ensure future loyalty. But the ruling dynasty would be permitted to continue under Chinese overlordship. But Gao Xianzhi had other plans. Despite the king's peaceful surrender, despite the absence of resistance, the Chinese general ordered his troops to sack the city. The streets of Tashkent ran red as soldiers looted homes and temples, carrying away everything of value. The king and his family were bound in chains and dragged away as prisoners, destined for the long march to Chang'an where the emperor's justice awaited. It was a betrayal that shocked even Gao's own officers, a violation of the unwritten laws that governed warfare in the region. The treachery did not end there. When the caravan bearing the captive king reached the Tang capital, Emperor Xuanzong ordered his execution. The ruler who had surrendered in good faith, who had opened his gates to spare his people the horrors of siege, was put to death like a common criminal. News of this betrayal spread like wildfire across the trade routes of Central Asia. In bazaars and caravanserais, merchants whispered of Chinese duplicity. In the courts of minor kings, rulers who had once viewed Tang protection as a guarantee of security, if submission now wondery meant only slavery and death. The executed king's son fled westward, carrying with him tales of Chinese treachery and a burning desire for vengeance. His destination was Samarkand, the jewel of the Silk Road, where a new power was consolidating its grip on the western reaches of Central Asia. The Abbasid Caliphate, fresh from its revolutionary victory over the Umayyads, was eager to establish its legitimacy through conquest and expansion. When the Prince of Tashkent arrived at the court of the Abbasid governor, he found willing ears for his pleas for justice and revenge. Ziyad ibn Salih, the governor of Samarkand, was a man who understood opportunity when it presented itself. A seasoned commander who had risen through the ranks during the Abbasid revolution, he possessed both the military expertise and political acumen necessary to challenge Chinese dominance in Central Asia. The prince's tale of betrayal and murder provided him with the perfect justification for military intervention. Here was a chance to strike a blow against the Tang Empire, while positioning the Abbasids as the protectors of the oppressed peoples of Central Asia. The governor immediately dispatched urgent messages to Abu Muslim, the legendary general who had led the Abbasid revolution from its base in Merv. Abu Muslim, architect of the Abbasid victory and master of the eastern provinces, understood the strategic implications immediately. Control of Central Asia meant control of the Silk Road. Control of the Silk Road meant unimaginable wealth and power. The request for reinforcements was approved without hesitation. As spring turned to summer in 751, two massive armies began converging on the Talas River Valley. From the east came Gao Xianzhi, with the disciplined legions of the Tang Empire. His forces included not only Chinese troops, but also contingents of Karluk Turks, fierce nomadic warriors whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and promises of plunder. From the west advanced Ziyad ibn Salih at the head of an Abbasid host that reflected the diversity of the Islamic world. Arab cavalry rode alongside Persian infantry, while Central Asian allies brought their own specialized skills to the coalition. The stage was set for the most consequential battle in Central Asian history. Two empires, two civilizations, two ways of life were about to collide in a valley that would soon be soaked with blood. Neither commander could have imagined that their confrontation would not only determine the fate of Central Asia, but would also trigger a chain of events that would transform the flow of knowledge itself across the ancient world. The convergence of these mighty armies created a spectacle that had never before been witnessed in the remote valleys of Central Asia. For days, dust clouds on the horizon announced the approach of the rival forces, growing larger and more ominous with each passing hour. Local shepherds abandoned their flocks and fled to the mountains, carrying tales of endless columns of warriors stretching beyond the curve of the earth. The very ground seemed to tremble under the weight of tens of thousands of marching feet, the thunder of hooves, and the rumble of supply wagons laden with the tools of war. Gao Xianzhi arrived first, his scouts having identified the strategic value of the ground near the Talas River. The Chinese general deployed his forces with the precision that had made him famous throughout the empire. His core strength lay in the disciplined ranks of Tang regulars, professional soldiers whose training and equipment represented centuries of military evolution. These men carried crossbows of devastating accuracy, their bronze-tipped bolts capable of piercing armor at ranges that left enemy archers helpless. Supporting them were units of heavy cavalry, armored lancers whose charges had broken enemy lines from Korea to Kashgar. Yet the bulk of Gao's army consisted not of Chinese troops, but of Karluk Turkish allies. These nomadic warriors brought skills honed on the endless steppes, where survival depended on mobility, cunning, and the ability to strike without warning. Their recurved bows could loose arrows with lethal precision from horseback, and their intimate knowledge of the terrain made them invaluable scouts and raiders. But their loyalty was a fragile thing, bound more by immediate advantage than lasting bonds of allegiance. When Ziyad ibn Salih's forces finally appeared on the western horizon, they presented a sight that must have given even veteran Chinese officers pause. The Abbasid army was a living testament to the diversity of the Islamic world, a coalition that spanned continents and cultures. At its heart marched the Arab warriors who had conquered half the known world in less than a century. These men carried with them not just weapons of steel, but the burning conviction that they fought for a divine cause. Their battle cries echoed across the valley, proclaiming the greatness of their faith and their determination to spread its influence to the ends of the earth. Alongside the Arabs rode Persian cavalry, heirs to an ancient tradition of mounted warfare that stretched back to the days of Cyrus and Darius. These horsemen brought with them tactics and strategies refined over millennia of conflict, their knowledge of siegecraft and battlefield engineering proving invaluable to their new Islamic masters. Central Asian allies added their own specialized skills to the mix, bringing intimate knowledge of local conditions and the loyalty of tribes who had suffered under Chinese rule. For 3 days, the armies faced each other across the narrow valley, each commander studying his opponent and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air grew thick with tension as soldiers sharpened weapons, checked armor, and made their peace with whatever gods they served. Priests and imams moved among the ranks, offering blessings and prayers, while officers inspected formations and refined their battle plans. The Chinese deployed in the traditional formation that had served them well across countless campaigns. Their crossbowmen formed the front ranks, protected by large shields and supported by reserves of arrows that seemed inexhaustible. Behind them stood the heavy infantry, professional soldiers whose discipline had been tested in 100 battles. The Karluk cavalry occupied the flanks, positioned to exploit any breakthrough or counter enemy attempts at encirclement. Across the valley, Ziyad arranged his forces with equal care. His Arab spearmen formed dense formations in the center, their long weapons creating a forest of steel points that glittered in the summer Sunday. Persian cavalry waited on the wings, ready to charge when the moment presented itself. Central Asian auxiliaries filled the gaps, their diverse weapons and fighting styles, adding unpredictability to the Abbasid battle plan. When the battle finally began, it opened with a thunderous exchange of missiles that filled the sky with death. Chinese crossbows released their bolts in disciplined volleys, each salvo precisely timed to maximize casualties among the enemy ranks. The accuracy of these weapons was legendary, and the first few volleys took a terrible toll on the advancing Abbasid forces. Arab archers, armed with more traditional bows, found themselves outranged and outmatched by their Chinese counterparts. But Ziyad had not risen to command through recklessness. As his archers fell back behind the protection of the spearmen, he ordered his infantry forward in a massive assault, designed to close the distance and neutralize the Chinese advantage in ranged combat. The clash, when it came, was tremendous, a collision of shields and spears that sent shock waves across the battlefield. Men grunted and strained against each other, pushing with all their strength while stabbing over and under their shields. For hours, the battle raged without decisive advantage to either side. The Chinese crossbowmen continued to thin the enemy ranks whenever gaps appeared in the fighting, while the disciplined Tang infantry held their positions with grim determination. The Abbasid spearmen pressed forward with religious fervor, but found themselves unable to break through the wall of Chinese shields and steel. The turning point came not from superior tactics or divine intervention, but from treachery that caught even the experienced Gao Xianzhi completely by surprise. As the battle reached its climax on the 4th day, with both armies exhausted but neither willing to yield, the Karluk contingent that formed the majority of the Chinese force made a decision that would echo through history. Whether through prior arrangement with the Abbasids or simple opportunism in the face of a stalemate, the Karluk warriors suddenly turned their weapons against their Chinese allies. The attack came from behind, striking at the most vulnerable moment when the Tang forces were fully committed to their frontal assault. Chinese soldiers who had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves surrounded, attacked from front and rear by enemies who knew their formations and weaknesses intimately. The betrayal was devastating in its completeness. Within moments, the disciplined Chinese battle line dissolved into chaos as units found themselves isolated and overwhelmed. Officers shouted contradictory orders as they struggled to understand what was happening, while common soldiers fought desperately against enemies who seemed to appear from everywhere at once. The careful formations that had been the foundation of Chinese military success for centuries crumbled under the weight of treachery and surprise. Gao Xianzhi, veteran of countless campaigns, recognized the disaster unfolding around him with the clarity that comes only to truly experienced commanders. The battle was lost, his army was being destroyed, and survival now depended on immediate and decisive action. Around him, his staff officers were already falling to Karluk blades, while the advancing Abbasid spearmen closed in like a tightening noose. The Chinese general's escape from the catastrophe became a legend in its own right, a tale of heroism and sacrifice that would be remembered long after the political consequences of the battle had faded into history. Siye, one of Gao's most trusted subordinates, gathered what remained of the armored cavalry and launched a desperate charge designed not to win the battle, but to cut a path through the encircling enemies. The sacrifice of these brave men allowed Gao and a handful of survivors to break free from the killing ground, but the price was terrible. Of the thousands of Chinese soldiers who had marched confidently into the valley, fewer than 2,000 would ever see their homeland again. The rest lay dead on the blood-soaked ground or found themselves captives of an enemy who would soon discover that they had captured far more than mere soldiers. Among the prisoners dragged away from the battlefield were men whose capture would prove more valuable than all the gold and silver looted from the Chinese baggage train. These were not warriors or generals, but humble craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through generations of Chinese families. They were papermakers, masters of an art that had remained a closely guarded secret of the Middle Kingdom for over 6 centuries. In the hands of these captive artisans lay knowledge that would revolutionize the Islamic world and eventually transform human civilization itself. Ziyad ibn Salih was no fool. As his soldiers stripped the dead and bound the living, the Abbasid general issued orders that would echo through history. "Kill the soldiers if you must," he commanded, "but spare the craftsmen. Bring me any man who works with his hands, any prisoner who possesses knowledge of the arts." The victorious Muslim forces, still drunk on their triumph over the mighty Tang Empire, may have wondered at their commander's strange priorities. Why spare Chinese prisoners when revenge demanded their blood? But Ziyad understood something that would not become clear for decades to come. The papermakers found themselves in chains, marching westward along the same trade routes that had once carried their precious product to distant markets. These men had awakened that morning as free citizens of the greatest empire on earth. Now they stumbled across foreign soil as captives of an enemy they had never seen before. Yet in their minds lay secrets that would prove more powerful than any weapon wielded on the battlefield of Talas. They carried with them the knowledge of how to transform simple materials into sheets of writing surface so superior to parchment and papyrus that it would revolutionize human communication. The process these craftsmen guarded was deceptively simple yet impossibly complex. They knew the precise mixture of mulberry bark, hemp fibers, and cotton rags that created the perfect pulp. They understood the delicate balance of water and timing that determined whether the finished product would be strong or weak, smooth or rough. Most importantly, they possessed the subtle skills that could only be learned through years of apprenticeship under master craftsmen who had jealously protected their trade secrets for generations. As the prisoners were distributed among their captors and sent to various cities across the Abbasid realm, some found themselves in Samarkand, that great crossroads of the Silk Road where East met West in an endless exchange of goods and ideas. Here, in workshops that had once produced only rough textiles and crude writing materials, the Chinese papermakers were put to work under the watchful eyes of their new masters. What began as forced labor would become one of history's most consequential transfers of technology. The first sheets of paper produced in Samarkand were crude affairs, lacking the refinement of their Chinese predecessors. The captive craftsmen, working with unfamiliar materials and under the constant threat of punishment, struggled to recreate the perfection they had once achieved in their homeland workshops. But gradually, as months turned to years, they began to adapt their ancient techniques to local conditions. Central Asian mulberry bark proved different from Chinese varieties, requiring adjustments to processing times and chemical treatments. Local water sources contained minerals that affected the final product, demanding further modifications to traditional methods. Yet slowly, inevitably, the quality improved. The papermakers, perhaps hoping to earn better treatment or simply driven by professional pride, began to produce sheets that rivaled those created in the imperial workshops of Chang'an. Word of this miraculous new writing material spread through the markets and madrasas of Samarkand like wildfire. Scholars who had struggled with the expense and scarcity of parchment suddenly found themselves able to acquire writing material at a fraction of the traditional cost. The implications were staggering. In a world where knowledge was literally written in gold due to the astronomical cost of writing materials, the availability of cheap paper represented nothing less than a revolution. Books that had once been treasures affordable only to the wealthiest nobles could now be copied and distributed to common scholars. Libraries that had contained perhaps hundreds of volumes could suddenly expand to hold thousands. The very nature of learning and scholarship began to transform as knowledge became accessible to broader segments of society. But the Abbasid rulers were not content to keep this miraculous discovery confined to Samarkand. Recognizing the strategic and economic value of paper production, they established workshops in Baghdad, Damascus, and other major cities of the Caliphate. The Chinese papermakers found themselves dispersed across the Islamic world, each forced to train local apprentices in the secrets that had once belonged exclusively to the Middle Kingdom. What had begun as the forced labor of war prisoners evolved into the systematic transfer of one of humanity's most important technologies. The economic impact was immediate and profound. Paper production centers became magnets for scholars, scribes, and merchants from across the known world. The Abbasid Caliphate, already wealthy from its control of trade routes, found itself with a monopoly on a product that every literate person desperately needed. The profits were enormous, and the Abbasids carefully guarded their new advantage, preventing the further westward spread of papermaking knowledge for several centuries. Meanwhile, in the libraries and scriptoriums of Baghdad, a golden age of scholarship was beginning to unfold. The House of Wisdom, established by the Abbasid caliphs as a center of learning and translation, became a beacon that drew scholars from across 3 continents. Here, surrounded by thousands of books made possible by cheap paper, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars worked together to preserve and expand human knowledge. Ancient Greek texts were translated into Arabic, Persian works were copied and distributed, and new discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine were recorded for future generations. The Chinese prisoners had inadvertently triggered an intellectual revolution that would reshape the Islamic world and eventually reach far beyond its borders. Universities emerged in cities across the Caliphate as the availability of books made formal education practical for larger numbers of students. Legal scholars, too, could now afford extensive maintained libraries of precedents and commentaries. Poets and historians found eager audiences for their works as the cost of publication plummeted. Scientific knowledge, once confined to small circles of elite practitioners, began to spread more rapidly as researchers could afford to acquire and share texts describing the latest discoveries. Yet even as paper production flourished in the Islamic world, the Chinese maintained their silence about the disaster at Talas. Official histories minimized the defeat, attributing it to the treachery of barbarian allies rather than acknowledging any fundamental weakness in Chinese military doctrine. The loss of the papermaking secrets was not even mentioned in most accounts, perhaps because court historians failed to grasp its long-term significance. To them, the battle represented merely another frontier setback, regrettable but not catastrophic in the context of the empire's vast territorial holdings. This official silence meant that news of the technological transfer was slow to reach other parts of the world. European merchants and scholars, already disadvantaged by their distance from the great centers of learning, remained dependent on expensive parchment and papyrus for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire, despite its extensive trade connections with the Islamic world, failed to acquire papermaking technology until much later. The lag in European adoption of paper production would have profound consequences for the development of literacy, scholarship, and eventually the printing revolution that would transform the continent. But in the immediate aftermath of Talas, these long-term consequences remained hidden beneath the more obvious political and military results of the battle. The Abbasid victory had demonstrated that the Tang Empire was not invincible, encouraging other peoples along China's western borders to reassess their relationships with the Middle Kingdom. Tibetan forces, sensing Chinese weakness, began probing deeper into Central Asian territories that had previously been firmly under Tang control. Turkish tribes that had submitted to Chinese authority began to waver in their loyalty, calculating whether the time had come to throw off the imperial yoke. The Battle of Talas stands as one of history's most consequential encounters, where a single act of treachery changed the course of civilizations. What began as Gao Xianzhi's arrogant betrayal in Tashkent culminated in the collapse of Chinese dominance in Central Asia and the inadvertent gift of papermaking to the Islamic world. From the blood-soaked plains of that distant valley emerged a new chapter in human knowledge, as captured craftsmen carried secrets that would illuminate libraries from Baghdad to Cordoba. The Demon King's downfall was complete, but from his defeat arose something far greater than any military victory.